Welcome to our discussion on the demographic transition. Let's start by looking at the world as Thomas Malthus saw it in around 1800, because we just finished talking about Malthus. Population was basically held in check. During this period, population growth was limited by various factors, including high mortality rates and limited resources. The average life expectancy was just 27 years, reflecting the harsh living conditions and high mortality rates. The total fertility rate, TFR, was 6.0, meaning that on average, every woman had 6 children. However, many of these children did not survive to adulthood. People often postponed marriage into their mid-20s, which helped to limit the number of children they had. Infant mortality rates were extremely high, with many children not surviving their first year of life. Economic conditions were highly sensitive to population changes. Wars and famines could drastically reduce the population, leading to temporary increases in wages and production. Overall, the population growth was slow due to high mortality rates and limited resources. The world was divided, though, into the East, or the Orient, and the West, or the Occident, with different cultural and economic conditions in each region. The demographic transition theory was developed by Frank Notenstein in 1945. He used it to explain the changes in the population dynamics observed in the Western world. This theory helps us understand the historical population trends, particularly how they transition from high birth and death rates to lower rates. One of the questions this theory addresses is why the Western world appears to be more advanced in terms of economic and social development compared to other regions. The demographic transition describes the shift from high birth rates and death rates in pre-industrial societies to low birth and death rates in industrialized economies. This transition typically occurs in 4 stages. Phase 1, high fertility, high mortality, called the pre-industrial society. Phase 2, high fertility, declining mortality, called often developing countries. Phase 3, declining fertility, low mortality, called developed countries. And Phase 4, low fertility, low mortality, post-industrial society. We're going to discuss this critically, but first we need to learn the way people accept it today. We will be building a demographic transition graphic here. This is the first stage. This stage is known as phase 1. It has a high birth rate, high death rate. It's often pre-industrial revolution communities. They have very little public health, very little sanitation. Population growth is very small. It pretty much balances out. Currently, this is true of remote tribes, particularly in the rainforest. The demographer who developed this identified the birth rate as high because of lack of family planning, high infant mortality, and the need for agricultural workers. Therefore, children are economic assets. The death rate is high because of disease, famine, lack of sanitation, lack of education, and competition for food, such as rats or other vermin. Now we're going to move on to the second column in this graphic, called Phase 2, or Stage 2, Early Expanding. Here you can see the death rate is declining, but the birth rate is high. So this occurred in Western society during the Industrial Revolution. There was better public health, there was a little more sanitation, but the population growth was super fast. See the population just increase dramatically. This characterizes countries today like Afghanistan, Laos, and Nigeria, and also 19th century England. The declining death rate was due to improved healthcare, particularly vaccinations, improved sanitation, improved food production and storage, and decreased infant mortality. As a note, stopping child death significantly raises the average life expectancy because you start eliminating all those zeros. But it also does mean your population will start to grow really fast. We continue looking at our graphic in the third column, which is often referred to as late expanding. I'd like to point out that this line here is the total population of the society as it's growing. And the green area is the natural increase, which I'm going to look at again more closely here. There's declining death rate, declining birth rate. This was most of industrialized societies during the 20th century. Population growth was still fast, but look, it is slowing as the birth rate is coming down. This currently characterizes some parts of India and Bangladesh and other countries. Phase 3 has declining birth and death rates due to family planning, lower infant mortality rates, the mechanization of agriculture, which is a technological advance, increased standard of living, and improved status of women. Now we move into phase 4, often called the low stationary development. In stage 4, there is still the low death rate and the low birth rate. And notice that this pattern here is very similar to this pattern here, which means that in essence, the population growth is very slow. And now that is basically where we're at, but we have to consider stage 5, which could possibly be declining. We don't know if it's actually existing or what will happen. This is world today in many countries. We have a rising death rate, but very, very low birth rate. This is characterized by the modern time, and the population growth of the world actually has a negative natural decrease. Your first question today is, which of the following best describes the demographic transition theory, which is a theory that describes the shift from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates as a country develops economically. Demographic transition theory, here referred to as DTT, was developed to explain historical phenomena in the West, like most of Europe and the colonized aspects of North America. However, how applicable is it then to non-European countries? It has definitely shown to be relatively accurate. However, there are definitely some wobbles in that translation. One important aspect of the demographic transition theory is it links population growth with economic development, which means if there's rapid population growth, you cannot have does not necessarily translate into rapid economic growth. There are a lot of assumptions in the DTT. Historical fertility rates were always high everywhere according to this theory, which we know is not necessarily true. Historical mortality rates fell before fertility rates. There's also the assumption that pre-industrial societies would or could not control their own fertility, also often up for debate. And the Western medical and contraceptives are perhaps the only way to control fertility. Your second question is, which of the following is an assumption of the demographic transition theory? The correct response is that Western medical and contraceptive advancements are the primary means of controlling fertility. While one absolutely has to be aware of the assumptions, there are definitely some advantages to this DTT. It can be used as a predictor of population growth. It can be used to shape population policy, and it can be used to characterize developmental stages. This is the words first world, second world, and third world were developed, which have recently been changed to developed, developing, and undeveloped, even most developed, developing, and least developed, and of course, who could resist not using letters like MDC, DC, and LDC? Another significant disadvantage of the demographic transition theory is that it completely ignores migration and it assumes a one-size-fits-all developmental model, which we know in our world is not always perfect. Also, the timescales are very different. For the global north, it took 200 years or more for this transition to occur. However, the global south, it's basically taken about 50 years. Also, it's what we call it's in the beginning model, which basically means explains initial stages of development but may not fully capture the complexities of modern demographic changes. Privileged countries have already completed the transition, and they're often overlooking the unique challenges faced by countries still in earlier stages. Finally, the DTT does not clearly define when a country stops being developed or developing and becomes developed. This can create ambiguity in categorizing countries and understanding their development status. The important takeaway here is that understanding these disadvantages will help us critically evaluate the applicability of the DTT and recognize the need for more nuanced approaches to studying population dynamics. Historically, the world has been divided into the Orient and Occident. However, with the demographic transition, we now categorize countries into three groups: First world, developed; second world, developing; and third world, less developed. This classification helps us understand the varying levels of development and the specific challenges each group faces. There are two main branches of policy that emerge from the demographic transition theory. The contraceptives are the best form of contraception emphasizes the importance of providing access to contraceptions as a means of controlling the population. This approach is neo-Malthusian in nature as it aligns with the Malthusian principles of controlling population growth to prevent resource depletion and economic strain. Also, another branch of policy is the development is the best form of contraception. This second branch argues that economic and social development is the most effective way to reduce fertility rates. As countries develop, they typically experience lower birth rates due to improved education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. This approach focuses on addressing the root causes of high fertility rates through comprehensive developmental policy rates. Both branches of policy, contraception and development, aim to accelerate phase 2 of the demographic transition. The first approach focuses on providing access to contraceptives to directly reduce fertility rates. By enabling families to plan and space their children, this policy helps to lower birth rates more quickly. The second approach emphasizes economic and social development as a means to shorten the duration of phase 2. As countries develop, improvements in healthcare, education, and economic opportunities naturally lead to lower birth rates and a faster progression through the demographic transition. Both strategies are essential for managing population growth and supporting development. By combining efforts to provide contraception with broader developmental initiatives, people feel we can effectively navigate the challenges of phase 2 and move towards a more stable demographic future. Your final quiz question is: explain why the demographic transition theory is not necessarily applicable to every population in the world at all times throughout history. If you are completely stumped by this question, I encourage you to look at the notes in the provided PowerPoint.